Okay, I'd like to introduce myself. My name's Laura Lamb from the Department of Economics, School in Business, Thompson Rivers University. I've been asked to do a webinar for the business plan competition, and I'm going to do a webinar on the business cycles and their impact on the development of a business plan. The business cycles is a concept used in macroeconomics to describe how the economy's total level of output, or GDP, fluctuates with booms and recessions in the economy as a whole. As you'll see on the slide, the business cycles can be illustrated over time, and the business cycles consist of 4 phases. First, initially, you'll see we have a peak stage. This is where the level of GDP has reached a maximum in the cycle. It's just prior to some change or shock that causes the economy to contract. The second phase is called recession. This is when the level of output is contracting in the economy. It's a period of falling levels of GDP. The third phase is a trough. So this is when the recession has bottomed out, has reached a minimum. So this is where the level of GDP or output has reached a minimum in the cycle, and this occurs just prior to some change or shock that causes the economy to begin to expand. And then fourthly, we have the recovery, also known as the expansionary period, and this is the period in which levels of output are rising. So the business cycle is the movement of current levels of output around a trend path, generally following these 4 phases. And we'll see that over time, if you graph an economy's level of output and GDP over time, it's evident that the business cycles exist. Okay. So the business cycles have a somewhat regular pattern of expansion and contraction in economic activity. But note, each business cycle is unique. For instance, each peak reaches a different level of GDP, as indicated on the graph, and the length of time it takes an economy to recover from a trough to the next peak varies considerably. For instance, look to the next slide. This slide shows actual data from the Canadian economy, and it shows business cycles of 3 different recessions. So the most recent recession, 2008-2009, is shown in red. And we can see that the economy hit a trough within a year period. Now this was different, that say from the recession from 1981 to 82, shown in the light color blue, where it took close to a year and a half for the economy to hit its trough before it started to expand again. And then we see in the dark blue the effect of the recession in 1990-91, where it looked like it hit a trough right around the 1-year mark. So every business cycle is unique, every recession is unique, every expansionary and recovery period is unique. So it's unique in terms of the amount of time it takes to hit a trough, how fast the economy recovers. Now that we've seen the picture of the business cycles as a whole, let's take a closer look at each phase. So if we take a look specifically at phase 1, the peak, indicated by the arrow there, or one of the peaks that's indicated by the arrow, we see that at a peak, inflation is at a maximum. Unemployment is close to its lowest point, and output cannot grow any more in the short run. So what causes the upward trend to change? So in other words, why did we hit a peak? Why didn't the economy just continue growing upward? Well, it can be because of a change or a shock, an event such as a financial crisis, an oil crisis, or it could be a change in a political regime, or it could be an event that's far more subtle. Phase 2 of the business cycle, the contraction. So this is always illustrated by the downward sloping sections of the business cycle. Once the level of output has begun to fall, okay, so this happens right after the peak. Once the level of output, or GDP, has begun to fall, households and businesses change their expectations about the future. So these expectations are in regard to future income, future job security. When we talk about businesses start to change expectations about future revenues, future sales figures, future profits. This leads to less household spending and less business investment spending. So the recession becomes somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, in addition, foreign consumers also change expectations and often react in the same way, leading to a fall in exports. So in this recession or contraction stage, as it's called, unemployment typically rises and price levels may fall. Now, the economic definition of a recession is to have at least 2 consecutive quarters of falling levels of GDP. So in other words, 6 months of falling levels of output. Okay, let's take a closer look at phase 3, the trough. So the trough marks the bottoming out of a recession. So this occurs at the end of a recession when output levels have reached a minimum in the business cycle just prior to recovery. So what causes this downward trend to change? So in other words, why didn't the economy just continue trending downwards? Well, again, it's often some type of a change or shock that will mark the end of a contraction period. It may be a government stimulus spending package that causes the change. It may be expansionary monetary policies, such as the central bank cutting interest rates, or it may result from something much less deliberate, like a technological change. So now let's take a closer look at phase 4, the recovery stage. Okay. So this is where the downward spiral of expectation stops. Initial increases in the level of output and spending lead to optimistic economic forecasts. So again, expectations change. This time they're changing in a positive direction. So in the recovery stage, as the economy expands, household consumption spending rises, business spending rises, and exports increase because spending by foreigners also rises. So over time, price levels begin to rise, unemployment rates fall, and the trend continues until we reach the next peak. Okay. This next slide just really gives a summary of the 4 phases of the business cycle. In the expansion recovery period, we have a sustained period of rising real income. In the contraction recession period, the contraction period is a period of time where the business cycle exhibits falling levels of output below full employment. At the peak, which is the highest point at the end of the expansion, this indicates the start of a contraction, and the trough, again, the lowest point at the end of a contraction and the start of an expansion. So, after going through this, consider what phase are we currently in? So what phase are the economies currently in? And we'll look at both the Canadian and the U.S. economy. So there we see, indicated by the red arrow, that the Canadian economy is in the recovery stage and close to the trend line. The U.S. economy is also in the recovery stage, but a little bit further down the trend line. So both economies are in the recovery stage. The Canadian economy has bounced back quicker from the previous recession than the U.S. economy. And this is confirmed by some recent statistics. So for an example, price levels have begun to rise already in Canada. That's something we typically see in a recovery period. So recent inflation rates in Canada have been reported to be 2.3%, where in the U.S. they're 1.6%. The unemployment rate in Canada is 7.8%. In the U.S. it's 8.9%. The economic growth rate in the 4th quarter of 2010 was 3.3% in Canada and 2.8% in the U.S. So all these signs indicate that the Canadian economy is just a little bit ahead of the U.S. economy in terms of the recovery period. And this is confirmed by the central bank interest rates, where the Federal Reserve in the U.S. has maintained the central bank interest rate at 0.25%, where in Canada it has risen to 1%. In the next slide here, we look at business cycles in the U.S. since 2007. So we can clearly identify the 4 phases of the business cycle over this 4-year period. Okay? So we see that the U.S. economy was somewhere around a peak at the end of 2007, beginning of 2008, at which time it started to decline, went into a contraction recession period, And it appears that the trough is somewhere around the second quarter of 2009, after which started a recovery, the period we're currently in. The following slide shows the business cycles in Canada since 2007. Again, the phases are fairly clear. It looks like Canada reached a peak somewhere around the middle of 2008, after which time it started to decline, started to go into a recession, which bottomed out and hit a trough around the middle of 2009, and since then we've been in a recovery period. Other macroeconomic variables also exhibit cyclical behavior, such as the unemployment rate. This graph is of Canadian data, but very similar trends would be evident in U.S. data as well. Unemployment rates tend to follow the business cycle phases, but they trend in the opposite direction. So for an example, a rise in the level of GDP is associated with a fall in the unemployment rate. Note that the changes in the unemployment rate often lag behind changes in the level of output. For example, when the level of GDP in the economy begins to contract in the recession phase, the unemployment rate will take a little while to start to rise. The unemployment rate often reaches a peak after the level of output has reached the trough stage. In the next slide, we see cyclical behavior of the inflation rate in Canada over about a 40-year period. Again, U.S. data would reveal very similar cyclical trends. Inflation rates also follow cyclical trends. Inflation tends to rise in the recovery and expansion phase and fall in the recession phase. However, there are exceptions. In the case of stagflation, high inflation is associated with falling levels of output in the recession phase. For example, during the oil crisis in the early 1970s, both the Canadian and U.S. economies suffered from stagflation. The current business cycle phase suggests the following trends. So given that both the Canadian and U.S. economy are in a recovery stage, we expect unemployment rates to fall, income levels to rise, consumer confidence to rise, followed by consumer purchases rising, business investment spending will rise, and we will see increases in price levels as illustrated in the inflation rates. Now, we don't know exactly how quickly the unemployment rate will fall. We don't know how quickly the income will rise, but we do know that it will happen. So a good business plan will acknowledge the existence of the current phase of the business cycle and explain how the success of their product fits into the current and future economy. The profit and success of many industries follow the business cycle, especially consumer durables such as automobiles, houses, major household appliances, consumer electronics, and jewelry. As we have clearly experienced during the recent recession, the sale of new cars and new homes fell dramatically. On the other hand, some industries tend to be counter-cyclical, that is to say they do well during a recession. Some examples of these goods and services would be firms such as those providing insurance, right? So in a downward trending economy, people are unconfident about their job security, unconfident about their future, so they'll tend to buy more insurance. Also think about the used car parts industry. When an economy is in recession and people are uncertain about the stability of their job and income, they are more likely to purchase car parts for their existing cars rather than to purchase a new car. There are some industries that are not affected at all by the business cycles. These are usually the firms that produce what we call consumer staples: food, prescription drugs, healthcare services. So during the recovery stage, as the economy expands, the demand for consumer durables and luxury goods will rise. At the same time, rising interest rates will increase the cost of borrowing money, and rising prices may impact profitability. Consider how all these factors may affect your business plan. I hope this webinar has provided you with useful information that will enable you to write a strong business plan. Good luck in the competition.